Hello everybody, it's Max and Connor with you here again today for the second episode of Red Talks.
Aye aye.
Excellent, he's gone back to his northern roots. So today, following on from last week's discussion about why we need a left modernity, we want to start talking about how to formulate that left modernity. So we've got a couple of sort of things to talk about today, sort of three main points. The first is sort of why we haven't yet, sort of the failure of past Labour governments and other sort of left-wingers.
We're going to historicise and look at how the left was able to successfully construct and implement to a certain degree their 20th century left modernities, and then we'll move on from there.
Yes.
You want to carry on?
Sort of like Attlee, the Labour governments of the 50s. Then we want to talk about...
The 50s, you mean the 40s?
40s and 50s, sure. Then we want to talk about the utopian vision, and then we want to talk about what we can actually do, and because there's no point, as you'll hear, in having a utopian vision if you don't have a way to implement it. So sort of, I think we want to start really with Attlee, and more generally that kind of like post-war
Social democratic
democracy.
vision.
He's often seen, sort of by historians and by a lot of people, sort of now, as this accidental prime minister, this guy who kind of stumbled into leading the Labour Party and then taking them to victory in 45, riding this kind of like post-war wave. Michael Yago, or Jargo, however you pronounce it, in The Inevitable Prime Minister, challenges that slightly. And he does sort of say that Attlee is this really important, really actually very intelligent political operator. He knows how to seize it. And yes, he's lucky, but he knows what to do with that luck. I would slightly disagree, because Attlee really is an extremely lucky man to get where he gets to. And actually, is a terrible politician. I mean, he's unbelievably bad. And he's not bad in the way that people think that Corbyn is bad. He's bad because he is just unbelievably dull and very, very kind of like demure and like quiet and doesn't really know how to interact with people. Corbyn does. Corbyn can actually get a message out if you push him. Attlee was terrible. I mean, the Times obituary for him was actually very interesting, where they go, oh, well, he was a great moral character and a great sort of like socialist, and he did a lot of things in the country, but he was just, very, very, very drab. And that's kind of what loses us the election in 51. Do you want to come on?
To a certain extent, it's also to do with electoral boundary reform, but we'll not talk about that. What's important with me in terms of Attlee was how they successfully, and I think Attlee's government in Britain from 1945 to 51 is the most important post-war social democratic government out of any of the immediate post-war European governments. And by immediate, I mean end of World War II, coming straight after that. So more so than the coalition of socialists and communists in France, more so than any of the other European governments, more so than the Truman administration. Attlee's government is the thing that inaugurated the era of post-war social democracy and brought that left modernity to being, and made it concrete and lasting, at least for 3 decades. And it's part... I'll read a quote from a book on architecture, actually, by a guy called Owen Hopkins, called Lost Futures, The Disappearing Architecture of Post-War Britain. So this is the quote. Between 1945 and 1951, Attlee's government enacted perhaps the most transformative political programme Britain has ever seen, establishing the welfare state that would provide social security from everyone from cradle to grave. And then it goes on to talk about the National Insurance Act of 1946, the Education Act, and so on and so forth. And the book goes on, because it's a book about architecture, to say that what was important about the modernity that was constructed, and yes, this comes within a wider context of 20th century modernism, was that it wasn't just a political and an economic ideology, it was also a cultural construction. There was aesthetics, there was art, there was architecture, and particularly a big fan of the architecture, but also of the other things, and all of these other new emergent cultural trends that was partially influenced by the new technologies that emerged, the television being the quintessential example, especially with what the BBC was doing. And I know we like to disagree with the BBC a lot because
I love the BBC.
I love the BBC in concept. I just like to disagree with the fact that it was basically a McCarthyite institution through the Cold War, and still is. But in terms of the BBC's cultural output and the sorts of ways that it helped to construct a modernity, it was... how do I put this in words? It was able to embed modern ideas and modern living into the popular imagination, and it made it attractive. And so the idea of like the welfare state and the sort of council houses, and at the time council houses were this very attractive possibility. You would have a house to yourself. You wouldn't own it. It's not a home ownership dream. It's you get to inhabit it yourself. It's not the slum conditions of pre-war and wartime Britain. It's not this vermin-infested, unhygienic place where you are forced to live with several people in the same room. It's this progressive vision. And I mean, this progressive vision has been demolished. Essentially, it's been completely demolished with post-Thatcher era. Look at Chavs. I'm not going to explain that argument. Chavs by Owen Jones goes into this in good detail, but it talks about how
it's a demonisation.
It's the demonisation of the working class, and the use of council houses is a way to do that. But that's getting ahead of ourselves. But bringing it back to how modernity was constructed post-war, it was not just this economic and political vision, but it was aesthetic and cultural. And one of the lines from this book on architecture was in how the right react to it, and I'll read another quote. In autumn 1951, Attlee's government lost the general election to the Conservative Party under Winston Churchill, and despite the popular success of the Festival of Britain, and interceding in the quote, if anyone doesn't know, the Festival of Britain was this thing that they put on in 1950, or was it 51? I can't remember. 50 probably, where they built this giant South Bank Centre, like exhibition centre. It was to showcase the new Britain that was being constructed. It was to show the new architecture, the new culture, the new institutions that we were building, to be proud of this new country that we were forging in the wake of World War II. It was, and it was a big success actually in terms of public appeal. But coming back to continue the quote, despite the popular success of the Festival of Britain, many on the political right viewed it as little more than socialist propaganda, and who could blame them, to be fair?
It was.
Soon after returning to office, Churchill had the festival buildings torn down and the site cleared, leaving only the main festival hall as the built reminder of that monument to popular optimism. And I think this is very important and a salient point, because you could have left the buildings intact and just said, oh, we're not doing any of that anymore, but the physical destruction of the concrete, quite literally because it was built with concrete, of the concrete embodiments of this new modernity, the destruction of that, and it, because of these things embodying popular optimism and the left modernity that was being constructed of social democracy, the destruction of that was very symbolic in saying, we will not carry this on. And I think the tragedy of the 1950s is that, yes, while we were able to set the social democratic precedent, and we were able to make it politically impossible for them to go back to the 1930s in the 1950s under the Churchill, Macmillan, Eden, and these sorts of Tory administrations of the day. The failure of the left at that time was that we weren't able to carry that through and do even more. And I think this goes to a wider point with the problems of social democracy within the left modernity of the 20th century, of the mid-20th century. And that was that it seemed that the problem, to me at least, is that social democracy didn't actually go far enough in its utopian vision, and it actually limited its vision long term to what it could achieve in praxis, or in the immediate goal, in terms of nationalising the commanding height, setting up the welfare state. But a lot of people seem to think, to a certain extent, myself included, that practically everything that Attlee wanted and the post-war social democratic Labour government wanted was essentially achieved. Some things not so much, but essentially you almost got everything you wanted. And if you do that, and this is something that people believe en masse, then where are you to go from there? What's there to progress to? And moving on to like Harold Wilson, I think by the time the 1960s rolls around and you can say, oh, there's been all this mismanagement under successive conservative administrations, so we have to do the sorts of white hot heat of the technological revolution, which is a fantastic slogan, and I'm a big fan of that, and the sorts of 1960s new trends, which I think combine collectivist ideas with sorts of individualist ideas, and then that kind of led the way into actually enabling sorts of individualist currents to emerge in the 60s, which we somewhat talked about in the last episode.
We don't like. Well, I don't like. You are more ambivalent.
Yeah, I'm more ambivalent. I don't like liberal individualism, but I'm not strictly collectivist as Marx is, but I'm sure he'll come on to that later when we talk about utopianism.
Collectivist. Anyway, carry on.
Yeah, and the problem with social democracy being too limited, in reverse of that, the problem with 20th century communist visions was that it was almost too utopian, and that its goals were, not actually achievable within the frameworks and the institutions that they established in the Soviet Union, in the People's Republic of China, in Eastern Europe generally. And I think where these two things intersect, where social democracy has a limited vision and communism has a too extensive vision that doesn't have the praxis to enable it, was that their visions were derived from almost a mistaken understanding of class. And going back to the last episode, we discussed how in the 1960s the new left emerges, and there is this sense that the old left of Leninist vanguardism and social democracy deforms into totalitarianism, into authoritarianism on the Leninist side, and is basically autocratic and not actually achieving anything that the left was supposed to be setting out, and almost an admission of that is Brezhnev's declaration in 1977 of we are going to have developed socialism, and so on. And then the rejection of social democracy being that, oh, well, what are we doing here? We're not achieving anything, we're just managing what we have at the moment. And it's like, oh, it's just become bureaucratic and managerial over the managing what we have at the moment. I've just said that twice now.
It's almost a Weberian kind of like rule, where you're not actually achieving anything anymore. All you're doing is setting yourself up to maintain, to just coast along. It's actually, I mean, I know this is it's a satire, but it's actually almost like a Yes Minister, Sir Humphrey Appleby style thing, where it's kind of like,
absolutely, yes.
The point is not to actually do anything. The point is to make sure that the status quo is maintained, and which I think is very interesting. And actually, just to quickly interject on your point about the Soviet Union, I talked about it last week as well, but hypernormalization again comes into this.
Always bring it.
It's not actually Adam Curtis. It's a Soviet writer ex-Soviet writer whose name I have completely forgotten, which makes me a terrible person. But it's really interesting how that kind of pie in the sky utopian vision actually contributes right at the end to its collapse, because essentially no one believes anything that anyone says, but you just do it because what else is there to do? Anyway, sorry. On to class.
So we discussed this briefly last episode, and it seems that the prescriptions that the left had come up with, both in terms of their utopian vision, but also in terms of their praxis and what led to their downfall in the 60s onwards, was they were approaching what to do and what we were going forward doing with almost too limited or a misunderstanding of class in the objective sense. And there's, just to specify, there can be two senses of class, both the objective sense in terms of how it actually works and the culturally constructed social sense of what people imagine themselves as, and they don't necessarily have to coincide, of course. We did discuss that last week, didn't we?
I don't know.
I can't remember. But basically, my understanding of class comes from, I'm going to read you a quote from a book called Class Theory and History, Capitalism and Communism in the USSR by Stephen A. Resnick and Richard D. Wolff. And Richard Wolff is one of my favourite economists. He's an American Marxist economist. But here's the quote. I'll preface the quote by saying they spend a little bit of time discussing two understandings of class that the left had, one being based on property and one being based on power, where the property one is basically who owns the property and who gets the results of the property, and the power is who has power within institutions and basically who's giving commands and who's giving orders. And yes, these are perfectly good, but they're somewhat limited, and this is a somewhat extensive quote, but here we go. In contrast, we define class differently. For us, class refers to how society organises the production, appropriation and distribution of surplus, and by surplus they mean surplus value. Stated simply, this definition of class presumes that in all societies, one part of the population interacts with nature to produce a quantity of output. The total quantity of output always exceeds the portion that is returned to this part of the population, i.e. the workers, for its consumption and reproduction. This excess is the surplus. A second part of the population immediately receives the surplus from the producers. And finally, a third part of the population obtains distributions of the portions of the surplus from the second part. Any society's class structure refers to how it organises its population in relation to the surplus as 1. Surplus producers, 2. Surplus appropriators, and hence distributors, and 3. Recipients of distributed shares of the surplus. That's quite technical. Basically, what it means is who makes the wealth, who gets to control that distribution, and who receives the wealth. Now, under capitalism, understanding capitalism from this perspective of objective class, according to Wolff and Resnick, basically means capitalism is a situation in which the workers, i.e. the producers of surplus, are one group of people and the distributors are another group. And the consumers are the third group. Now, the consumers are actually the same people as in both the workers and the collectors. What did I just say? The appropriators, that's the word. So, who makes the wealth and who appropriates the wealth, both of these groups constitute the third group. Under socialism, they argue, that is a situation in which the people who appropriate and control the distribution of the wealth is the same as the people who produce the wealth. So essentially, a socialist distribution of class would be where all three are occupied by the same group of people, and that's why they categorise the Soviet Union and also social democracy as capitalist, because you maintain a situation in which the producers of wealth are not the same group of people as the people who appropriate and distribute the wealth.
Basically,
that's a very roundabout way of saying
what Connor was trying to say is that
I'm not very good at explaining this.
Yeah, and that's why I'm here. In both post-war social democracy and in the USSR, what you have is an inequality. It's an inequality in the surplus, and the only way to solve that inequality is to make it democratic.
Yeah.
Is to democratise work.
Yeah, basically the problem with the left in the 20th century was that its prescriptions came off of the property definition of who owns what property and the power definition of who gives what orders, particularly the former definition, and therefore their prescriptions were, okay, well, socialism must mean not private property, it must mean state control, it must mean nationalisation. But nationalisation isn't inherently socialist, and neither is central planning. All that does, and I'm going to use this word, and I will definitely copyright this quote, except I don't believe in intellectual property, but if the state subsumes the functions of capital, it itself becomes a capitalist. Like, if you nationalise the means of production, the state becomes the exploiters of the working class. The workers are still alienated from the means of production, despite the fact that the state is supposed to represent them, either in the sort of Leninist vanguard model or the sorts of social democratic parliamentarianism. Either way, the workers are alienated, and the production of the surplus is done by a separate group of people to those who control its distribution. So that is still a capitalist organisation. And so the prescriptions based on the property understanding of class, that there were these misprescriptions, in a way, of the 20th century, led to basically communism and social democracy and all the problems that these entailed. And that kind of comes back to where we were before about bureaucratic managerialism and authoritarian degeneration. And yeah, you look like you want to come in.
I mean, I want to come in because I want to basically like argue with Connor, and say, so one of my favourite historians, as you remember I mentioned last week, is Edward Palmer Thompson, and in his introduction to the making of the English working class, he talks about class and what it is, which I think in a very interesting way.
In the objective or cultural sense.
Here's the point. If we remember, this is a quote by the way, if we remember that class is a relationship and not a thing, we cannot think in this way. It does not exist, either to have an ideal interest or consciousness, or to lie as a patient on the adjuster's table. Nor can we turn matters upon their heads, as has been done by one authority, whose name is R. Dahrendorf, in the study of class obsessively condemning methodology to the exclusion of the examination of a single real class situation in a real historical context. He then quotes extensively from Dahrendorf, and continues, the question, of course, is how the individual got to be in this, quote, social role, and how the particular social organisation, with its property rights and structure of authority, got to be there, and these are historical questions. This is why I wanted to historicise. This is why we wanted to start the podcast with a historical look, because class in and of itself, in my opinion, and Connor slightly disagrees with me on this, it is a historical question. It's also economic, and it has
of course. History and economics is perfectly... they intersect so much.
That's what an economic historian does. And
you hate economic history, so...
I don't hate economic history, I just hate the way it's written. Economic history, if you ever have a chance to read it, it's unbelievably dull. Like,
when it's written by economists, when it's written by anthropologists, it's unbelievably interesting.
Get out of here, your anthropology. Anyway, I just wanted to read that because I thought it was a really interesting look.
But yeah, actually, that's a really interesting thing, because I actually think he's basically saying a very similar thing to what Resnick and Wolf are saying. And he's basically saying that class is not this abstract or objective or this thing. Well, it is. There is the objective sense. Sorry, it's not this thing in itself. It's a relationship between groups of people in specific relation to how they operate within the economy in terms of producing goods and services, i.e. the surplus. And I think the thing that a lot of people on the left misunderstand in terms of class, at least in my experience of talking with other leftists, is that they see class as a macroscopic thing rather than a microscopic thing. And class, it originates on the micro level within the relations of production. Of course, that can scale up to macro scale in terms of, well, you get lots of people in the same class collecting together on a societal level. But fundamentally, class comes out of how production relations are organised. Yeah. I think that's a thing. It's not just who owns what property and who gets to tell people what to do. It's fundamentally about the relationship between the people who make wealth and the people who control that distribution.
I think there's actually an interesting synthesis that we can make here, and I don't know if you'll agree, Connor, whereby one can say, on a microscopic level, it is very much this relationship between an individual and their relationship to surplus value, and then on a macroscopic level, it then becomes this kind of very much historical lingerie movement towards a collected group, rather than just each individual's relationship to the surplus. I think maybe I haven't worded that very well. Do you know what I'm getting at?
Kind of. Are you basically saying that
It slightly changes.
that the
basically.
collective
is far more
collective class is like
historical.
yeah.
Once the
Basically.
micro class is purely, or not purely economic, but is much more heavily economic.
I don't. No. I think they're both basically roughly equal in terms of they're both being historically constructed, but that's because the economy is historically constructed and it's like evolved from like slavery to feudalism to capitalism and so on and so forth. So basically, like, yeah, as far as I'm concerned, the micro class in terms of relation of people to the surplus value, and macro class, it basically roughly exactly the same relationship, but yeah.
We disagree heavily.
Do we want to come
Do you want to talk about Proudhon?
Proudhon, yes. Actually, do you want to introduce utopian?
Well, yeah, I mean, sort of, what the other thing that we want to talk about quickly, because that was more on praxis, but
that was more on the failures of praxis in the 20th century.
Sorry.
Just so we can have a historical framework to know what not to do.
Yes. The other side of that, and the other sort of upswing, is when you fail to have, or when you have basically this overarching utopian vision that has just no basis in reality. And do you want to start with Proudhon?
Yeah, so actually linking into the discussion we've just had on class, Pierre-Joseph Proudhon, who is the father of left anarchism, specifically he was a mutualist, or started the mutualist school. Marx very much didn't like it. Well, actually, reading Marx, you'll find that he's actually quite complimentary, but at the same time he's just like, except he's wrong in like almost every way. But Marx does that a lot.
He didn't get,
so yeah, this, I'm not reading exactly from Proudhon, I'm reading from a book on, or this quote is going to come from a book called Workers' Control Under Plan and Market by Ellen Turkish Komiso, I think is how you pronounce her name, who basically wrote this book on Yugoslavia and the experience of worker self-management there. And she starts the book with 2 chapters on theoretical frameworks for workers' control in relation to Gramsci and in relation to Proudhon. And on Proudhon, I think she sums up what Proudhon argues quite nicely. And this is the quote. Proudhon's mutualism represents an attempt to embody what he calls the principles of justice in human relations. To Proudhon, justice is a relation, or, quote, a balance, between persons and forces, both of which are equal and free in the sense that neither can be subordinated to the will or force of the other, or to some third party. In practice, justice means guaranteeing each member of society an equal share of wealth and equal conditions for producing it, so that there can be free contract between equal parties for the reciprocal exchange of equivalents. These leftists can never just write simply, can they?
Oh, they're unbelievable.
Yeah, so basically, the most important line there is the point about equal conditions for producing it. Linking in with what we were just talking about. And the vision that I get from that is that workers' control is what needs to be put forward, because workers' control is based upon the sorts of collective, but also not just collective, because you can be collectivist and be authoritarian, but the sort of libertarian or democratic collective. And the point that she points out about it not being where you don't subordinate others to the will of the larger group, where individuals still maintain their autonomy. That is why I'm specifically thinking democracy, because in democratic relations, it's almost a voluntaristic thing. I mean, it's not purely voluntaristic in the sense that like right-wing free market libertarians of the sort of Ron Paul type would use that sense of the word voluntary. But in terms of through the democratic process, as a collective, you can decide how to create the surplus, how to manage and distribute the surplus, and so on and so forth. And that's what Proudhon's mutualism is at its core about. And I mean, I'm not a mutualist. Yeah, or it also goes on to say stuff about how perfect competition in a perfect market, where if you get rid of private ownership of property, if you've got these sorts of producers, cooperatives, competing in a market, that you'll get the best outcomes, which, I mean, then you have all the criticisms of the market that you could make on that regard. So I'm not full mutualist, but the point he makes about equal conditions of production and democracy is pretty central,
Very
I think.
important. And I think, I mean, a guy who did this many moons before Proudhon is, of course, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, my favourite man.
Did you want to talk about the general will in relation to autonomy of individuals?
I mean, so this is what Rousseau says. He says that the problem of governance, essentially, is to find a form of association which will defend and protect the whole common force. Protect with the whole common force the person and goods of each associate, and in which each, while uniting himself with all, may still obey himself alone and remain as free as before. It's that entire idea of essentially maintaining individual liberty whilst also being protected by the community. Because leftists, like you said, can't write in a simple way, so we have to kind of try and pass what they were saying.
I mean, I know I'm illiterate, but I don't think this problem was the whole left, but okay.
Well, the problem isn't that they're illiterate, is that they're like very floral, and you're kind of like, you have to cut through all
We're
of it.
too literate, because we just write very nice things that sound nice on paper, and then you read them and it's just like, oh, Jesus Christ, what the fuck is that?
But I like Rousseau because I think that is the central problem of governance, is how do we make sure that we're not going to infringe on anyone's liberty, whilst also maintaining a just democratic system. I mean, Rousseau doesn't like democracy, but that's a separate point, I guess. Yeah. Was that all we want to say on utopianism?
Did you want to speak about Robert Owen? Robert Owen, if I'm remembering my history correctly, comes around slightly before or around about the same time as Proudhon.
He's 1820.
And 1820s.
1829, yeah.
Is that when he's born?
No, that's when he's sort of active.
All right, so early 19th century, roughly the same time period, and they have somewhat similar ideas, and it seems like the problem of utopianism is that they have these ideas about, they have these almost proto-class ideas, but it's not fully formulated, and to a certain extent you can't blame them because capitalism wasn't being fully formulated, and it was really uneven in the early 19th century. It was only just spreading to France after the Revolution because they'd only just smashed feudalism. It still wasn't in Germany until at least mid-19th century, and it was the most advanced capitalist country at the time was obviously the Great Britain. But even there, you'd still only just started because the steam engine was still a new thing at the time. The spinning jenny was still a new thing. Railways weren't really a mainstream thing, so you hadn't really got into full-on industrialisation by this point, and so it hadn't fully formed. And so this whole thing about class that class analysis discussion we had wasn't fully there yet, and the problem of utopianism in the early 19th century, the sorts of Charles Fourier, the Owenite experiences, was that they basically had based their ideas almost on a sort of, to a certain extent, an ethical discussion, on a moral discussion, and these sorts of proto-class ideas. So the experience of New Harmony was that they tried to create New Harmony. For those who don't know,
it was the 1,000-person settlement that Robert Owen sets up.
Robert Owen, who do you want to talk briefly about it?
I mean, Robert Owen is the guy who comes up with Owenism. It's named after him. Sort of this early 19th century philanthropist.
Scottish industrialist.
Welsh.
Welsh.
He's
Okay.
Welsh.
Okay.
And he basically goes, there's lots of poverty in Britain. Writes a report about the poor laws and says we need to do way more. Sort of converts to full on sort of socialism, and then kind of sails off to America to set up this community which Connor's talking about.
So yeah, New Harmony is this utopian community that he sets up. 1,000 people roundabout-ish. I don't know the exact number.
It's 1,000.
And it's quite influential, and it's one of the earliest experiments in sort of communal or communitarian living. They're sort of trying to organise production on this communal democratic principle, but they haven't got these fully formed ideas about how these relations should emerge. And you get, correct me if I'm wrong, but you get all the problems of people trying to live communally and not really knowing how to do it.
There's a guy who writes a letter whose name I've forgotten, but it's actually very interesting, where essentially he complains and he says, well, we don't have any private property, so how on earth are we meant to live? It's very, very interesting reading sort of correspondence from the community and watching it kind of descend in sort of a J.G. Ballard high-rise style disaster. It's very, I mean, it's fascinating, and I really like Robert Owen, and I mean, you love Robert Owen, because that's what we'll talk about later, cooperatives and land reform, but he, as we're saying, he doesn't have this
it almost seems like the problem was that they were trying to do too much all at once.
It's not even that, it's that he doesn't have, like, he has this utopian vision because he sees problems and he wants to solve them, which is admirable, but he has no solid basis from which to work.
Yeah, I mean, Marx criticises Owen and Owenism quite harshly for having, well, it's utopianism, for not having what Marx calls a scientific basis and a sort of, I mean, it almost comes back to the point about dialectical materialism, where history evolves about sort of the thesis of the old society, the antithesis of these sorts of oppositional ideas, and from these you get the synthesis of what the new society is, and that the utopian project was essentially too abstract, and it was basically saying, there are problems, this is what we're going to do, and then it's not really a synthesis. It's like it's the antithesis. Why can I not speak? Antithesis. Fuck my life.
Carry on.
It's like that stage of the dialectic. And on the point I was making before about it seems like they're doing too much all at once. So, Proudhon's mutualism, as I just said earlier, exists within a market system, and Proudhon is not opposed to the market. Differs somewhat from other forms of market socialism, but generally speaking, it is market socialism. And what you get from Proudhon is he's trying to address the problems of the organisations of the workplace, the organisations of business, and that sort of thing. And what you get from Marx is almost, he does address these problems, but I think the focus is more on the capitalist system as a whole, the problems of the market, the law of value, these sorts of things. And the problem, and going back to the very start where we were discussing 20th century modernities, that the prescriptions that come more out of Marx than out of Proudhon is you end up with central planning, because people presume that the problem is the market, not necessarily the organisation of production and the division of labour itself. Of course, that's not everybody, but we are generalising because we don't have time. We don't have enough time. We've only got an hour left. We're about a third of the way in.
Yeah. But okay, so I think we've
done enough historical background
kind of
in terms of. Yeah.
So what the hell do we do? I mean, not to put too blunt an edge on it, but what we want to talk about now is this
constructing a new left modernity for the 21st century, and how do we construct that both in terms of a utopian ideal and also of a concrete praxis, or the steps towards a concrete praxis that we could put in place. So last episode, when we talked about how modernities generally function to act to inspire people towards a future, to give people hope that the future will be better than today, this idea of progress, but also to provide some concrete basis on which you can act in the immediate time period in order to inch towards it. And I think we have some ideas on the left, the contemporary left, in terms of 2017 when we're recording this, in terms of what to do. Do you want to start with utopianism? And the construction of a new utopianism?
So, I mean, the problem with, as we were saying with old ones, is that they don't really have any basis in reality. So we want to kind of focus and have kind of not reached too high, but also have something to aspire to. So it's not this kind of like, oh, there are poor people, we should probably do something about that. It's not this Fabian moralism. It's far more rooted in our ideas of class and on making sure that you're not kind of like just also not uprooting society and saying, oh, it's all nonsense. You have to be quite careful about historical development, I think. Although you're frowning at me.
Oh, am I?
Yeah, you went.
Well, no, I basically agree with that. So.
Yeah, it is important, because otherwise what you're doing is you're not actually allowing yourself, you're not giving yourself any breathing room, you're not constructing anything. So, in terms of utopianism, what do you want?
In terms of utopianism, well, there's a lot of good ideas on the left at the moment as to what a utopian vision might be, and my favourite one, and this is probably because I'm a massive science fiction fan, is the technological future. This idea of a fully automated society, and we're going to go with the full meme here: fully automated luxury gay space communism with lasers.
With lasers?
With lasers.
Moon lasers?
Moon lasers. Yeah, to make Breakthrough Starshot a reality, because I want probes in Alpha Centauri within my lifetime, goddammit. But yeah, that's getting rather off topic.
Well, no, it's not, though.
It's not, actually, because space is cool.
But more than that, I mean...
The Star Trek future is basically what I'm getting at as this utopian vision. And
yeah,
the idea of fully automated luxury communism has been around since about 2014. The term was invented by Aaron Bastani from Novara Media, and it's since gone on to spawn wonderful meme pages on Facebook, with like statues of Lenin juxtaposed against like LGBT flag backgrounds and Star Trek pictures. It's wonderful.
It's
yes.
quite odd. But
you don't like it, but I like it. But basically, the idea of this utopian vision is that at some point in the future, we can completely eliminate human labour from everything that we don't want to do. Of course, there will, in terms of labour, actually, we should make a distinction, because I can't remember. Is it labour that is the thing you do because of necessity, and is it work that is the thing you do because you want to do it, or is it the other way around? Is it work that you do?
The other way around, because labour is what makes us inherently human. We sell that labour for work. I thought it was the way it operated.
And that's why we have alienation. Yeah, yes. Okay. So basically, whichever way around it is, the idea of this utopian, fully automated future is the idea that everything that we don't want to do, or even if we did want to do it, if you particularly didn't want to do it as an individual, even if large portions of the population did want to do it, your needs and your wants, both of them, not just needs, could be satisfied by technology, by the use of innovation, by machinery, by AI, to satisfy basically anything that we could possibly desire. It's almost like walking through the door into Willy Wonka's chocolate factory, and finding the Oompa Loompas have been replaced by machines, and everything you could possibly want, rivers of chocolate, that would be amazing, rivers of chocolate, will be done for you, and you are not forced to do that work by necessity or by a social economic system that compels you to do it. Of course,
starve to death.
Yeah, there's not the compulsion of do this or starve to death, do this or be homeless, do this or whatever, do this or be sanctioned from the welfare system.
Exactly.
There's not these compulsions. Of course, lots of people will still find enjoyment and find fulfillment from these roles, so of course these things will still happen. I mean, even if we had fully automated gardening robots, I'm sure lots of people would love doing gardening.
Allotments exist.
Yeah, allotments exist. I'm sure some people would love to run, like, I'm sure a lot of people who work in I'm going to call them salesmen, but they're not necessarily, that's not necessarily the right word. But
do you mean like salespeople?
You know, when you go into like bazaars, or that's the Turkish term for it, merchants. A lot of people enjoy interacting with customers and trying to sell them things, but a lot of people also do that just because they have to get money, and they really don't find that appealing. But in a fully automated society, the people who want to do that can still do that. So it's not that robots will make us redundant. It's that robots can emancipate us from necessity. And the other side of this, because full automation in itself doesn't necessarily imply post-scarcity, but there is also the second vision, which I would touch on, which is this post-scarcity vision. And this partly comes from Murray Bookchin, who wrote Post-Scarcity Anarchism. And I'm not necessarily going to suggest that we can get there by anarchism, but the idea that we could have full automation and combine technology with the ability to produce large enough surpluses of goods and services that basically nothing will ever run out, and we can consume to our heart's desires. I mean, actually, I don't think consumption would actually be pushed all that much, because we'd be moving there via a social system, hopefully, that would be much more communitarian, and you wouldn't be. There's the point that you'll like to make about Rousseau, where he talks about man comparing himself to others.
There's no jealousy. There's no comparison.
Yeah,
there's no
under
envy.
full automation and post-scarcity, if you have a social system that is constructed in order to facilitate that and in order to produce people that can inhabit that realm in a way that doesn't abuse the system and doesn't destroy it, you can almost eliminate jealousy. You can eliminate greed, because what's the point? You could have literally anything you want. I mean, I'm not expecting replicators from Star Trek to show up anytime soon because they're quite far off technological wise. But like the possibility, like the vision that is shown in Star Trek, especially from Next Generation era, and the sort of 24th century vision of we are a society that has transcended needs. There's the line that Picard gives in. It's the last episode of season 1 of Star Trek: The Next Generation.
You're the biggest nerd in the world.
It's where the Romulans come back. But they find this time capsule, not time capsule, this capsule that's floating in space of like humans that have been cryogenically frozen since the 24th century. And there's this one who sums up 20th century people according to Gene Roddenberry, and I know you hate him, but the vision that they produce of 20th century people as being individualist, as being greedy, as being competitive, and this future utopia envisioned and embodied in Star Trek as being we have transcended needs, that no one goes hungry, no one is ill. What we do is for our human development to advance ourselves as a species and as individuals in terms of our own enlightenment, not in materialistic or consumeristic terms. I've always found that vision quite compelling, and it kind of links in with the old left modernities, but it's also. I think what we need to do is to take those elements of the technological future and this post-scarcity vision, and take what is best from the 20th century modernities about communitarian visions of how to construct society, and then take that forward. And that's what I've just said isn't particularly original, to be fair. But it's hard to construct a utopian vision living in a society as ours, where you can't really see beyond the future. It's very much it's not quite as bad now, but I think the quote, I think it's from Friedrich Jameson, where we can imagine the end of the world before we can imagine the end of capitalism. I think that still, to a certain extent, holds some validity, even though it's much easier to imagine an alternative system, I think, now than it was in the 1990s. We still aren't fully there yet. And do you want to add anything aside from what I've said about full automation and post-scarcity? And
I mean, I think there's something interesting whereby some people may be mistaking Connor's idea of there will still be salespeople for there will still be like petty bourgeoisie. But I think, do you want to bring in David Harvey? Because there's one of his 17 contradictions.
Yeah, let me find the quote. I've got the book in front of me.
Which I think is actually really interesting in this sense, whereby you're not necessarily abandoning. You are abandoning this kind of like competitive nature of I need to sell you this because I need money, and what you're actually doing is it's an exchange of goods, but it's people who want to distribute those goods. I suppose is how you would word it. Do you want to read out from the book?
Which one did you have in thinking? Was it number 6? Locomotion.
That wasn't number 6.
Oh yeah, okay. Found it. So basically, in David Harvey's fantastic book 17 Contradictions and the End of Capitalism, which I would definitely recommend, he spends the book, each chapter is addressing a contradiction within capitalism. And then at the very end, he has an epilogue called Ideas for Political Praxis, and there's 17 very short points, each one in response to each contradiction that he comes up with. And number 7 is, I'll just read the quote, associated populations assess and communicate their mutual social needs to each other to furnish the basis of their production decisions. In the short run, realization considerations dominate production decisions. And
which is a really complex way of saying you tell...
Goddamn leftists.
You basically tell someone, I need this thing, and that person goes, wizard, I'm going to give you this thing.
Oh, so 90s, bloody hell.
But that's the point. I mean, it sounds really facile when you say that, but it's like, this is a central thing that we don't get in a capitalist society because it's based on
I think
it's popular.
To me, that kind of sounds like we need to have planning rather than markets, but I know because I've read the chapter,
but it's
very planning. It's not centrally planning, and I think there's an interesting point to be made about a difference in terms of economic planning regimes between the difference between that which is directive and that which is collaborative and cooperative, and the central planned economies in the last century, as we discussed earlier, having this misunderstanding of class, goes towards a very top-down authoritarian structure of a command economy, and it's directive. There isn't really input for the workers. There isn't. You reproduce the class division, which means that you have state capitalism rather than socialism. And I think what Harvey's trying to get at is that we need to have a regime that is democratic and collective and communal, and it's associated populations. It's not populations that are controlled from the top down. It's, we are associating with one another by our own free will, by our own, to whatever degree free will exists. I'm not sure I'm actually convinced we have free will, but that's another thing. We're not going to do that philosophical debate. But coming back on that, that's number 7, that I've just mentioned, seems quite macro scale in terms of associated populations, meaning large scale communities.
Big groups of people.
Yeah. Another point, number 3 on his list, I'll read it out. The opposition between private property and state power displaced as far as possible by common rights regimes, with particular emphasis upon human knowledge and the land as the most crucial commons we have, the creation, management and protection of which lie in the hands of popular assemblies and associations. Now that seems like the sorts of micro-scale things, cooperatives, different forms of land ownership, and that which we want to talk about in terms of praxis, in terms of concrete steps we can make towards achieving a utopian vision and inching towards it, rather. Do you want to say anything else on utopianism and constructing a new utopian vision?
Part of why I wanted to mention David Harvey is to kind of segue, because we've kind of outlined this utopia where it's kind of this very technological state and it escapes this kind of social conservatism that kind of haunts a lot of other modernities, left modernities, and they are quite socially conservative in many ways.
I'll let you finish that in a second, but just to come in,
sorry.
We did say earlier that we were going to talk about identity politics, but I think we haven't really got enough time since there's only about half an hour until we agreed we'd end the episode.
Because otherwise we'll go on forever.
Otherwise we'll go on for several hours. So we'll talk about identity politics at a later time. But you said the technological state, and I actually envisage this as actually being able to enable the deconstruction of the state in very, I mean, Engels says it.
Here we go.
There's the Engels quote about, I can't remember the exact thing, but it's like, when we have a society based anew on the common ownership of the means of production and the common control over these things, that we will put the state machinery in the same place as the ox-driven cart and the spinning jenny in the Museum of History. And yeah, I actually kind of see that happening in terms of the state no longer... If you have this system of self-controlling AI controlling production, all of our wants and needs being satisfied, and so on, because of this organisation of society, this far-off utopia, the state almost becomes redundant, because the state is there to manage class disputes and to manage class conflict, and it's also there in terms of being able to allocate goods and services, in terms of, you know, redistributive taxes and these sorts of provisions of provisions of welfare, provisions of services, both for the working class and the working class is quite abstract, but in terms of the ruling class for its protection of the property regime, and in terms of everyone else in terms of getting services that you need, like police, health, and so on. If you have reached a point technologically where this can be done really kind of automatically via technology, then, and you eliminate class on that basis because no one owns the technology and there's common ownership of the robots, there's not really a purpose to the state, because it's basically you just punch in a number on a machine and it gives you what you want, and you don't need to pay taxes because you've eliminated money, and there is no redistribution because all of the surplus, I mean, the surplus is produced by the robots. We're not really producing surplus value anymore, because by that point you've transcended human... because if you've presumed value comes from labour, you've transcended that. Production of surplus in terms of goods and services in a use-value sense. And actually, coming back to Harvey as well, he does make a comment on that. He says that the direct provision of adequate use values for all takes precedence over the provision through profit-maximising market system that concentrates exchange values in a few private hands and allocates goods on the basis of the ability to pay. Again, terribly written.
It means social housing, free education, free welfare.
Well, that's the very much the social democratic
yeah.
understanding of it. But it basically means that if you're producing for need and for want rather than for profit, it almost doesn't matter how you distribute this, because you're not accumulating wealth from the accumulation of goods and services. And even if you are, there will probably still be inequality in terms of how much stuff people have, but that's not really all that important, because there isn't the inequality of power, there isn't the inequality of the ability to reproduce oneself, and so on and so forth. So that technological future is that utopian vision, which I'm not suggesting we're going to get there anytime soon. Shall we segue into the next bit, or did you want to say anything else?
I just wanted to quickly finish off and say, this is the point with the utopian visions, is that you don't place them completely out of reach, but what you do is you give us something to aspire to, and I think that's the key that's the key takeaway from this section, as long as it has been, and why.
I think the way to sum up what we've just had that roundabout discussion on is the utopian vision of technology should be that we can use the potential of technology to emancipate ourselves from need, from toil, and from the tyranny of scarcity, the tyranny of
jealousy, envy, hatred,
kind of, yeah.
anger. I mean, you know, I could quote Rousseau, but I won't. So we're going to move on.
Yeah.
Well,
okay, do you want to move on?
I think that we should move on, because
We've got about half an hour, so...
Yeah, so for the final section, Connor and I kind of really wanted to talk about practice. What actually can you do?
What can we do immediately to inch towards a utopian vision like this?
And more than that, what can we do now so that we can start building and constructing inside of the shell of capitalism some kind of vision, hope, actual solid thing, so we can get to somewhere near that utopia. I think it's a very
prefigurative politics to a certain extent.
Thank you very much.
Yeah,
that's the word.
Building a new society in the shell of the old.
Yeah,
that's a very anarchist quote.
I'm not an anarchist, as you may have guessed from the fact that I like the state.
Yeah. So, in terms of reforming the economy immediately, before we get full automation and before we get post-scarcity and so on, and to a certain extent, I actually think we could get post-scarcity in terms of some of the main necessities like food and energy and water and fuel for transport and so on. We could probably get post-scarcity of those within our lifetimes, given the technology that we have. But we'll come back to that in a minute. What I wanted to speak mostly about is cooperatives, which are my favourite thing ever, and land reform.
Awesome, you never shut up about.
Yeah, okay. So, if in the current system the problems are this class system that we started out with, then surely we should have an economic organisation of production where the same group of people who produce the wealth are the people who control its appropriation and distribution. So naturally, cooperatives seem to be the way forward. Now, there are many limits to cooperatives as they stand at the moment, but I think this is where the state has to come in.
I was going to say, do you very quickly, and I do mean very quickly, want to explain first what a cooperative is and where they stand currently?
So, going back to the point about utopianism before, cooperatives started in the early 19th century in, I think it was 1844, if I remember my history, with the Rochdale Pioneers in Rochdale, England, evidently. A cooperative is basically an economic unit or economic entity where all of the people who work there, well, actually there are varying different types of cooperatives, but I'll start with the producers' cooperative as it's the most simple. All of the people who work there, they collectively own the company, they collectively make the decisions on how to produce, where to produce, what to do with the goods and services, who to sell it to, how much to sell it for, and most importantly, what to do with the surplus, what to do with the profits. There are other types of cooperatives, so there are consumer cooperatives where the business is owned by its consumers. There are mixed consumer-producer cooperatives where it's owned by both. And there are varying other types, which I'm not going to get into. But basically, a cooperative is a business, a for-profit entity within the current constraints of capitalism that is an economic unit in which is in fact socialist, where the people who produce the wealth are the same group of people who appropriate and distribute it. And this has a number of obvious advantages. So under a capitalist business, you have shareholders or sole proprietorship, where the people who own the company and who appropriate and distribute the profits, they get to decide that without any democratic control, without any collective oversight. And naturally they are incentivized to give a large portion of the profits to themselves. So the pay gap between, or the pay ratio between the average, not the lowest paid, the average worker and the highest paid CEO or board of directors member or whatever, is somewhere, the average is something like 300 or 400 to 1 nowadays.
It's unbelievable.
Which is bloody hell. I mean, people always say, "Oh well, bosses work harder." Maybe they work somewhat harder in terms of they have the management to do and they're responsible for everything. Sure, okay, but
they do not work
400 times as hard as the average, not the minimum, the average. Jesus Christ. And actually, the cooperatives that do exist at the moment, they do not exhibit this behaviour at all, because no one will vote to give one person or a small group of people millions of dollars while everyone else has to suffer on the breadline. So the world's largest cooperative is the Mondragon Corporation, which is a conglomerate of many cooperatives. It has something like 80,000 members. It's in northern Spain, in the Basque region. Very successful, started in the 1950s under the regime of Franco. It was started by a Catholic priest, which is why it was allowed to operate, because anything else under a Franco regime would have just been crushed.
Shot in the back of the head.
Yeah, several thousand people were. And it started, I can't remember which particular industry it started in, but it's grown to do lots of many things. It even does its own research and development, and actually many large multinational corporations like Microsoft and Google often work with them because they have such good technological research. And the pay ratio there, from the average to the highest paid worker, and there isn't really any bosses because there is a division of labour, but they have elected management, so it's accountable and it's participatory to a certain degree. The average ratio there is somewhere in the vicinity of 6 to 1 or 9 to 1. And yeah, you can imagine someone working 6 or 9 times more than someone else in terms of productivity, which is probably the best way to qualitatively manage it, because you can't really quantitatively manage it, because you can't really qualitatively assess how hard someone is working, or maybe you shouldn't even do that, I would probably say. But yeah, in terms of immediate solutions, we should probably push for business cooperatisation, especially in the private sector, but also in the state sector.
What kind of ways we can do that, Connor?
All right. So basically, this would be dependent, of course, upon a progressive / socialist / generally in favour of working people and not rich arseholes, that sort of government. So basically, Corbyn, if we win the election, and if you're listening, and I've talked to John McDonnell about this and gave him some propositions, and he was just like, yeah, that's actually quite interesting.
And then he ran away.
No, I cornered him once at one of his new economics conferences. He wasn't allowed to leave, so I got to speak to him for an extended period of time. And basically, the suggestions I gave was that the state, McDonnell has talked about the entrepreneurial state, but I think what the function of a state should be in a reformist way should be to use its power to renationalise all of the major natural monopolies, so things like the railway, railways, energy, telecommunications, things that tend towards monopoly naturally, that can't really work well with competition.
The post office.
Yeah, and what you do with those is you nationalise those, and then the internal structure of those businesses can be co-determination. So you have partly appointed boards of directors by the state, and then elections from within the workers to decide a division of labour at each individual place, and to get representation at the top. And the workers should have the majority of control, and that state bureaucrats should really just be there for oversight and to make sure everything's kind of in line with generally what is good for the nation, and so on. And like at individual power stations or at individual railway stations or whatever, then the workers can be more or less autonomous with oversight from the top-down structures. And then participation, I mean, this is just a sort of abstract, idealised way. Obviously, it will work in practice somewhat. Maybe there'll be room for experimentation and we can see what works and what doesn't, and so on and so forth. We don't really have time to discuss them, but there are examples of co-determination in places like Germany, in Scandinavia. I'll not go into them because we don't have enough time. In sector, the same applies for sectors where we don't actually think they should be for-profit industries. So things like the health service, things like education, things that should be social rights, but that should not be making a profit, can be run relatively much in a similar way, I would probably think. And there are... I was actually reading this morning something about education in... Actually, it was in that book on... actually, I haven't got it with me. Basically, there's a book called... I can't remember its name. This is terrible. Basically, in the 1970s,
there is
a book, yeah,
that says something.
That says a thing. So it's a book on the economy of Malta in the 1970s, which is the most riveting reading, obviously. It's actually
Can I just say very quickly, Connor does this a lot, and he will wander into my room and will go, "I have something to tell you about the economy of Malta in the 1970s." I'm like, Connor, Go away.
So
Sorry.
basically, what happened in Malta in the 1970s was that there was actually experimentation in this sort of cooperative economic praxis, and the Maltese Labour Party, which was in power at the time, helped facilitate it. And they started with the dry docks, which was the most important economic asset at the time, and then it moved elsewhere. And I remember reading, it was only a short piece on teachers and the sort of co-determination in education, where at some point I think there was only something like that. Malta's not very big. It's a small island in the South Mediterranean off Italy and Tunisia. So the teachers, there weren't that many schools, so they were able to organise the schools so they had representation of the teachers at the top of government, in the government ministries that set educational policy and in how that policy is implemented on a school level. So unlike with Jeremy Hunt, what a twat that guy is, fuck him, and Michael Gove, who personally destroyed my English GCSEs and made me sit my exams early. I hate that man so much. Yeah.
No personal vendettas here,
no
obviously.
personal vendettas against Gove at all, obviously. But yeah, unlike in this country where we've had several instances of the government basically just saying, you know, all that educational policy, yeah, forget all of it. We're just going to tear it up and start again, massively to the detriment of both teachers, because they have to relearn how to teach everything, and there's new syllabuses. Is that plural? I don't know. And then and then even worse, to the detriment of children and students who might have to change how their education is structured, what they're learning, and so on.
Can I use a real
right in the middle of the way? Yeah, go ahead.
I mean, my brothers are 16 years old, and they're currently doing their GCSEs. They found out, I think, at the beginning of this year, so it's beginning of 2017, they've been doing their GCSEs since, like, 2016, that school year. They found out this year that their exams that are happening in, like, a month's time will be including, like, A-level, or old A-level work. So it's a bit like, well, that's not great. And this is the point that Connor's making, is that when you essentially just chop and change educational policy, you kind of ruin it for everybody.
And to give a personal example, again, when I was in year 10, which was in, what year was that?
2014? 2013?
2013. 12 to 13 I was in year 10. No, it was 2013-14. I was doing my English GCSEs, and it was then under the modular system where you did, here's your content, then you do the exam, then you move on to next content, then you do the next exam, and so on. And then I did the first round of exams, and I was not very good at English. I got a B, somehow, on To Kill a Mockingbird. And then Michael Gove was just like, who was the education secretary at the time, Conservative government under the coalition, he was just like, oh, all those English exams... Meaningless. You've got to do it all again under a linear system where you set all your exams at the end of year 11. And I was just like, I know for a fact I am not going to get a better grade. So I ended up, along with about 10 other students in my English class, sitting the content for the year 11 stuff a year early without having done some of it and having to like basically do extra work in year 10 with the people who were resitting in that same year, so that it was actually turned out quite well, because I ended up getting a B overall in both English literature and language, but I was able to not then have to do English in year 11. But basically, if he hadn't done a top-down reorganisation of that particular aspect of education, which comes from basically the government having complete control over it and not being democratic. Like, if teachers, but also students, I think, should have a democratic say over their own education, since it is their education. If teachers and students had input, they would not have elected to completely overturn everyone's education willy-nilly just for some weird ego trip that Michael Gove was going on at the time. Basically, if democracy was enabled, shit like that wouldn't happen.
And it wouldn't have to happen either.
I
think that... Sorry, I'm going to slightly pivot here and talk about this kind of top-down sort of regressive kind of change. And I actually want to talk about trade unions. Because we both quite like trade unions. I think that
to a certain extent. I think they're sometimes mostly quite impotent, but...
I think that they're fairly important, and they can be, yes. But that's what I want to talk about, and it's why
they are an important thing, and I'll come on to them as well. There you go.
But it's automation, and when you actually look at kind of like what trade unions do, is that they try and kind of like protect workers at the expense of workers' liberation. It's very, very odd.
Yeah, it is quite contradictory. And I think the thing with unions as well is that, take the steel crisis in the end of 2015 and start of 2016. If I was a unionist, well, I am a trade unionist, but if I was in the steelworkers union, I would not have just ruled. I mean, they did try and negotiate and push for like Tata and SSI and so on to not close the plants, and they were able to successfully get the government to kind of intervene in Tata and so on. SSI Red Car closed down. It was really bad. Several thousand jobs lost. The local economy destroyed. But the unions, they were fundamentally not looking in the right way. If they had basically said, you want to close down, that's fine. Bye-bye, I'll pay for your airplane ticket. But tomorrow, we'll come into work, we'll basically operate the factory as if nothing had changed, except you won't be in charge. We will democratically control this through the union. We will occupy your factory. It's basically seize the means of production. And there are interesting examples of this happening in Argentina in the 2000s after their economic crisis, where workers, I mean, it wasn't necessarily through the unions, but the workers autonomously did this, where they were faced with mass poverty, and they were basically just like, we're not going to put up with this. The factories are literally right across the street from us. They could be used to produce things we need, but they're not because they're all owned by foreign multinationals. Let's just occupy them and start running them for our own benefit. And what made the Argentine example successful, and now there are hundreds of cooperatives in Argentina that are successfully operating on a profitable basis, is that they didn't just exist as workplace struggles, but they existed as community struggles. And they integrated both aspects of the workplaces as where we need to produce things and where we need to get our incomes from, but also the workplaces contributed to building the community and pushing community cohesion together, and it's quite communitarian and in the way it was done. I am aware of the fact that we've got about 15 minutes left, so moving on.
You want to talk about land reform?
Also land reform, but I didn't mention co-operatization in what is now the private sector and what is the for-profit private sector. So we talked about natural monopolies and things we don't want to be making profits in terms of how the state should intervene to help to basically bring about workers' control through those mechanisms. In terms of the private sector, things that are otherwise profitable businesses that are actually competitive, there is a part of me that basically just wants to say, oh, well, the state should nationalise them and hand them over. But then there's the part of me that says, well, that's almost too much for the state to do in terms of reform. We have to strategise. And it's more important, I think, to get a hold of things that are natural monopolies first. So I think what the state should do is facilitate the growth and development of cooperatives autonomously, and we do this through a number of somewhat reformist measures. So first of all, we use the power of the state to basically crush the private sector in terms of private sector businesses, especially in terms of multinational businesses. We basically say, we are going to tax you out of the arse, in a technical term, to basically crush you. We also provide incentives to make cooperatives start up. And
also, I think, incentivise cooperatization. Like, if you're going to have a...
Yeah. I was going to say that in a minute.
Sorry, I didn't mean to jump ahead.
Yeah. So what some of the concrete things that we can do are... I'll just list some off. So in Italy, they introduced in the 1980s a law called the Marcora law, which basically says you can either, when you become unemployed, you can either get your however many weeks of unemployment benefit in packets until you find work, or you have option B, which is if you can find 9 other people who are willing to do the same thing, you can collectively all get your unemployment benefit as one lump sum, provided that benefit goes to becoming the startup capital for a cooperative enterprise. And as a result, Italy has, I think, the highest density of cooperatives of any country in Europe. And there's one particular region in Italy, in the north, Emilia-Romagna, I think is its name, where cooperatives make up something between a third and a half of their entire regional economy, which is quite impressive. And you have to build networks of cooperatives, not just monoliths that dominate individual sectors. You have to make it collectively sustaining. And there are other things we can do. We can basically say cooperatives aren't taxed on whatever profits they make until they become a certain profitability rate or until they grow up to a certain size. We can say, businesses, like private businesses, they have to get loans, but if you're a co-op, you can get a grant in order to set up things and so on. And I think an idea that I came up with in terms of how do you integrate cooperatives together and also make the state dependent upon the success of the cooperatives, so that in the future, when the Conservatives come back to power, inevitably it will happen at some point, even if we are elected in 5 weeks' time, that the problem with what happened in the 20th century was that you can essentially just use the state to completely reverse everything that you achieve. You can privatise nationalised industries, you can break up central planning mechanisms, you can marketise everything, and it's essentially a massive waste of time. With cooperatives, if you make the state dependent upon their success, then it can't do that with anywhere near as much freedom. And especially if you introduce democratic measures and make these things constitutionally speaking, so that the workers have what's it called?
What are you trying to say?
They have primacy, where the workers are the ones who are fundamentally in charge and the state comes second, that sort of thing. So I came up with this idea of what I call community cooperatives, but that's just a weird name. Basically, what happens is, rather than local government, so councils, city devolved authorities and so on, rather than them taxing co-ops like any other business, what you could do is you could have negotiations between each individual cooperative business and the local authority to say, we are profitable to a certain extent and we will give you a negotiated dividend to your local authority. That means that the local authority has a stake in, well, not necessarily a stake, but an interest in making sure that the cooperative sector that develops does well, because otherwise they don't have as much resources. And then you can use that money to provide public services that we don't want to be profitable public services, so things like health and education on a local basis. And then to link small individual cooperatives together on a national scale, I think unions could probably play a role here, but maybe not necessarily. But basically, federations of cooperatives to coordinate things. So rather than being forced to compete with one another, they can pool resources and build things. And we don't really have enough time to go in detail on that. And I'm probably going to mention this very briefly, but land reform, there is, and the UK especially, is the second least equal country in the world in terms of land ownership after Brazil.
Which is unbelievable.
It's something like 2% of the population owns 70% of the land.
Yeah.
It's terrible. So some concrete steps that we could do in terms of facilitating common ownership of the land is an idea that comes out of the US civil rights movement, is this idea of the community land trust. And it was pushed by Bernie Sanders in Vermont in the 80s and 90s, in the US as well. So basically the idea of the community land trust is to have common ownership of the land, but private ownership of the actual buildings and structures. And I think specifically this was pushed in the United States because they have a much more individualistic culture than us. They have this value of home ownership, and to be fair, we have appropriated that in Europe since the 1980s onwards. And it's basically, you want home ownership, you want to have sovereignty over your own home, but private ownership of the land does gentrification and is exclusive of that as a result. And you get pushed out of the city, you get pushed out of the suburbs, and so on. So common ownership. So the idea of the community land trust is that the CLT is a democratic communitarian organisation to which all of the people within a geographic area are members, and then the buildings are owned privately, but the land on which they sit is owned in common. And when you buy the building, when you buy the house, or when you're a business that moves in, you buy that building off of the community land trust at a price they set democratically, at a price that is collectively agreed to be affordable. And then when you move out, when you want to sell, you don't just sell your house or your building to whoever is next moving in. You are contractually obligated to sell it back to the community land trust at a price that they set to keep prices low, and then you move into wherever in a different community land trust, and then basically it keeps prices down so that you can have both the sort of home ownership vision but also the common ownership of the land vision. Max, do you have any comment on that?
I mean, I don't know as much about this as Connor does, but it's actually extremely, how do I put it? Extremely evocative, of kind of like older forms of land reform, where essentially what you're saying is you're trying to get rid of this kind of like speculatory nature of property. The reason that you have housing bubbles isn't because land has a use value.
It's because it can be.
It's because it could have a use value, and in the history of man, speculation is what causes financial crashes. In the 1930s,
well, I would dispute that it's the cause. It's definitely the catalyst, but there are always underlying causes.
Sure. I mean, the crisis of
But
capitalism.
we'll not talk about that.
I mean, we have no
We've got
time.
5 minutes.
But I think that's very interesting, certainly.
And actually, going back to what David Harvey, the quote I read about making use value, attainment of use values instead of production for exchange and profitability, this sort of land reform actually goes to the heart of that, because if you're using land if you're owning land in common and the prices of the actual buildings that you use as the use value are set democratically and kept at an affordable rate, you basically prevent speculative ownership of land, and it basically eliminates that market. Now, concrete steps to achieving this in the United Kingdom are actually quite straightforward, I think. What you do would probably be to liquidate all of the royal and like the remnants of the feudal system, the crown estates, all of these things. You basically just say, you don't have that anymore. Thank you. Bye-bye. Also, I'm a Republican, get rid of the monarchy, so that would fit in quite nicely with that. But basically, you liquidate the crown estates and bring them under public ownership, and then you use the state to construct these CLTs in that area. And in areas where you do actually have legitimate private ownership rather than feudal ownership, in places like London, in parts of the city, in places where people own both the land and their home, what I would probably just suggest that you do eminent domain to buy the land to set the prices. I would also probably suggest that this would probably cause a massive financial crisis, because the financial sector would just be like, what do you mean you're taking our speculative instruments away? So what you should also probably do before you do this sort of land reform is nationalise the entire financial sector. Amalgamate all the banking institutions into one institution so you can cancel out the interbank lending market, which is what is really dangerous. And then you can probably also do mortgage debt cancellation, because mortgage debt is what will cause financial crises, because it's what happened in 2007, and all we've done is reinflate the bubble. So we're coming up to our 8 to 10 year decade long cycle, and we're due for another one, so that would probably be a good idea.
It's going to be cars this time, no, Connor?
Of course.
Auto lending.
Yeah.
That's not a joke, by the way.
It's not actually. Auto lending is massive.
It's actually going to...
But basically, if you cancel all the mortgage debt and you nationalise the financial sector and then you facilitate this land reform, homeowners, they probably, if we can also get a hold of the media, there's lots to do basically. Hopefully this would not feel like we're infringing their right to property, because we're not actually taking their home away from them. In fact, we're making it easier for home ownership to be a thing. We're simply saying that we can't allow this to act as speculative, as a means for speculation for the 1%, as a means of make the rich getting richer and the poor getting poorer as a means to entrench inequality, and actually that this is the way forward in terms of expanding this dream of home ownership and realizing it. Even though personally I don't particularly aspire to it, a lot of people do, and being able to have sovereignty in your own house on communal land is, I think, it would be a good idea, and it inches us towards this utopian vision of. It's almost going to the social aspect that we didn't really discuss because the technology. We spent more time discussing the technology,
which I think is more important.
Which is more important. Going back to cooperatives as well, something that, in terms of technology, people might question whether cooperatives would want to do automation. I think, yeah, it would be fairly straightforward for cooperatives to automate because all they have to do is introduce these new technologies to reduce their own workload so that they can do less working time for the same amount of output, and then eventually you get to the point where you basically completely eliminate human labour from certain sectors. At that point, so say like transport, which, to be fair, goods transportation probably is something that could be competitive and cooperative, but when you automate all the truckers, when you automate all the railways, when you automate all the taxi drivers, at that point, you can nationalise those cooperatives. I'm also in favour of universal basic income in terms of being able to facilitate this. We don't have enough time to discuss that in detail. And something else, in order to drive cooperatisation, you could probably say if a capitalist business is going to automate, you can tax them at a higher rate, and at a certain point you can make that rate of taxation so much that it actually becomes more profitable for the capitalists who own it to cooperatize the business, so at least then they're having some semblance of an income from it rather than it just being used to drive inequality. Now I'm aware we are getting slightly over time, so do you want to say anything else before we bring it to a conclusion?
I didn't actually. I wanted to end it.
All right, okay, go ahead. I've basically rambled on for more than enough.
No,
we'll talk more about all of these things in the future as well.
I was about to say, I think that for anyone who's like, I don't know, panicking that we're never going to talk about this stuff again, we will almost certainly do an episode on cooperatives and an episode on land reform and things like that. I wanted to end with a quote, if Connor will let me.
Sure, we've got a lot of quotes in this episode.
I shall end this chapter and this book by remarking on a fact on which the whole social system should rest. The fundamental compact substitutes for such physical inequality as nature may have set up between men, an equality that is moral and legitimate, and that men, who may be unequal in strength or intelligence, become everyone equal by convention and legal right. Thank you.
Is that from Rousseau?
That is from Rousseau, that's from Social Contract. My name is Maximilian Mason. I've been with Connor Hodgson Bronica. Thank you very much.